Worthless piece of trailer trash like you doesn't deserve to sit while a real American veteran stands. The words cut through the crowded subway car like a blade, every passenger's head turning toward the commotion. Claire Morrison, a 78-year-old blonde woman in worn jeans and a faded hoodie, sat quietly in the priority seating section. Her small frame hunched over a battered paperback book. What none of them knew was that this worthless woman they were about to witness being humiliated had once been Lieutenant Claire Morrison, decorated Marine sniper with 3 tours in Afghanistan. And what the arrogant businessman shouting at her couldn't possibly imagine was that sitting just 2 rows behind them was Commander James Mitchell, who had served under Claire's command and knew exactly what this quiet woman was capable of when pushed too far. The morning rush hour on the Boston Metro Red Line was typically chaotic, but today carried an electric tension that seemed to charge the recycled air. Claire Morrison sat in seat 4A of the priority section, at destination reserved for elderly, disabled, and pregnant passengers. Her dirty blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her clothes told the story of someone counting every dollar, from her second-hand sneakers to the jacket that had seen better years. She kept her eyes down, focused on the dog-eared copy of The Things They Carried in her hands, a book she'd read countless times since leaving the military. The irony of the title wasn't lost on her. She carried plenty of things herself. Though most were invisible to the casual observer, Richard Hawthorne noticed her the moment he boarded at Park Street. At 45, he cut an imposing figure in his $1,000 suit, his graying temples and commanding presence suggesting a man accustomed to getting his way. As a senior partner at Hawthorne and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, he was used to being the most important person in any room. His morning routine was sacred. To board the Red Line at exactly 7:47 a.m., claim his usual spot in the priority section despite having no qualifying condition, and spend the 20-minute ride reviewing case files on his tablet. Today, however, his usual seat was occupied by what he saw as an obvious freeloader. "Excuse me." Richard's voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades dominating courtrooms. "This section is for passengers who actually need these seats." His cold blue eyes swept over Claire's appearance with obvious disdain. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the general seating area." Claire glanced up briefly, her green eyes meeting his for just a moment, before returning to her book. "I'm fine here. Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the train's rumble. She turned a page deliberately, hoping he would simply move on. The small metal pendant that hung from a thin chain around her neck caught the fluorescent light for a split second, the Marine Corps emblem briefly visible before disappearing back beneath her jacket collar. "I don't think you understand," Richard continued, his voice rising to ensure nearby passengers could hear his righteousness. "These seats aren't for people like you to lounge around while actual contributors to society have to stand." He gestured broadly, as if addressing a jury. "Look around. There are elderly passengers, people with real needs, and here you are taking up space like you own the place." The car had grown noticeably quieter, conversations dying as passengers turned their attention to the confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed to approve of Richard's stance, nodding along with his assessment. A few pulled out phones. Sensing the kind of public drama that went viral on social media, Claire felt the familiar tightness in her chest. The same feeling she'd experienced countless times since leaving the military when strangers made assumptions about her worth based on her appearance. "Sir, I'm not bothering anyone," Claire said, still keeping her voice low and controlled. "I paid my fare like everyone else." She deliberately kept her hands steady on the book. Though her knuckles had gone white from gripping it, the breathing techniques she'd learned in combat situations kicked in automatically. Slow and measured inhalations that helped her maintain composure under pressure. Richard stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that would have been threatening to most people. Paid your fare with what? Welfare money? Food stamps? His voice dripped with contempt. Let me guess. Another millennial who thinks the world owes them something. Sitting in seats meant for people who've actually sacrificed for this country. He looked around the car, playing to his audience. This is exactly what's wrong with this generation. No respect. No work ethic. Just entitlement. 2 rows behind them, Commander James Mitchell had been trying to focus on his morning briefing papers. But Richard's escalating tirade had captured his full attention. At 52, Mitchell was a career Marine with silver hair and the kind of quiet confidence that came from 3 decades of military service. He was heading to a meeting at the Boston VA hospital, where he now worked helping veterans transition to civilian life. Something about the young woman being harassed nagged at him. The way she held herself, the controlled breathing, the deliberate stillness that came from military training. You know what? Richard's voice reached a crescendo that had every passenger in the car watching. I'm going to do something about this. I'm calling the transit police and reporting this abuse of priority seating. He pulled out his phone with theatrical flair. Maybe a citation and fine will teach you some respect for the rules that decent people follow. Claire closed her book and stood up slowly, her movements precise and controlled. She was smaller than Richard by nearly a foot, but something in her posture made him take an involuntary step backward. You want the seat? She said, her voice still quiet but carrying a new edge. Take it. She moved to step past him, but he blocked her path with his arm. Oh no. You don't get to walk away from this. Richard sneered. You're going to stand here and explain to the transit police why you think you're entitled to special treatment while real Americans have to stand. His face was flushed with self-righteous anger, and spittle flew from his lips as he spoke. I bet you've never worked a real day in your life. Never contributed anything meaningful to society. Never put yourself at risk for something bigger than yourself. That was when Commander Mitchell stood up. His movement was smooth and deliberate, and despite being in civilian clothes, something about his bearing immediately commanded attention. Actually, he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command, I think you're mistaken about that. Richard turned, irritated by the interruption. Excuse me, sire, but this doesn't concern you. I'm dealing with someone who's abusing public resources, and I'd appreciate it if you'd mind your own business. Mitchell stepped into the aisle, his 6-foot frame and military bearing creating an immediate shift in the car's dynamic. See? That's where you're wrong, he said, his voice calm but filled with steel. This absolutely concerns me. He looked directly at Claire, and his next words cut through the tension like a blade. Because that worthless piece of trailer trash you're harassing is Lieutenant Claire Morrison, and she earned that seat through more sacrifice than you'll ever understand. The color drained from Richard's face as the implications of Mitchell's words began to sink in. Claire looked up at the commander with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief. The car had gone completely silent. The only sound, the rhythmic clacking of the train on the tracks. Lieutenant Morrison, Mitchell continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the car, served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a Marine sniper. She has 47 confirmed kills, saved countless American lives, and was awarded the Bronze Star with V device for valor under fire. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the suddenly uncomfortable passengers. She was medically discharged after taking shrapnel from an IED blast while providing overwatch for a convoy evacuation. Richard's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came. The phone in his hand trembled slightly as the reality of his mistake became clear. Several passengers who had been nodding along with his tirade now looked at their feet in shame, The reason Lieutenant Morrison was sitting in priority seating, Mitchell continued relentlessly, is because she qualifies as a disabled veteran. The shrapnel damage to her lower back and left leg makes standing for extended periods extremely painful. He stepped closer to Richard, his voice dropping to a level that somehow made it more intimidating. Not less, but she would never say that herself. Because she doesn't want pity or special treatment, she just wants to get to her job at the Veterans Counseling Center, where she helps other combat veterans deal with PTSD and readjustment issues. Claire felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from Richard's harassment, but from hearing her service acknowledged by someone who understood its true cost. She had spent the last 2 years trying to blend into civilian life, avoiding attention and especially avoiding conversations about her military service. The transition had been brutal, filled with nightmares, chronic pain, and the kind of survivor's guilt that made everyday interactions feel like navigating a minefield. I didn't know. Richard stammered. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. She doesn't look like a soldier. Mitchell's laugh was sharp and without humor. And what exactly does a soldier look like? Mr. He gestured for Richard to identify himself. Hawthorne. Richard Hawthorne. He replied automatically, his lawyer's instinct for providing information overriding his discomfort. Mr. Hawthorne, are you suggesting that Lieutenant Morrison should wear her uniform everywhere she goes? Should she pin her medals to her jacket so entitled civilians can properly assess her worth? Mitchell's voice carried the kind of controlled fury that made grown men reconsider their life choices, or maybe she should limp more obviously. Make her pain more visible so people like you can decide whether she deserves basic courtesy? The train was pulling into the next station, and several passengers were clearly eager to escape the tension, but most remained frozen in place, sensing they were witnessing something significant. An elderly woman near the front of the car called out, "Thank you for your service, dear," and her voice seemed to break whatever spell had held the car in silence. "Ma'am," Claire said, her voice stronger now. "Thank you. But I didn't serve for thanks. I served because it was the right thing to do." She looked directly at Richard, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he saw something in her eyes that made him truly understand what he was dealing with. Just like calling out injustice when you see it is the right thing to do, Richard cleared his throat, his face red with embarrassment and shame. "Lieutenant Morrison, I owe you an apology. I was completely out of line, and I'm sorry." He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "And thank you for your service." "Accepted," Claire said simply, "but maybe next time you see someone who looks different from what you expect, you might consider that you don't know their story." Commander Mitchell smiled at that, recognizing the teaching moment that Claire had extracted from her humiliation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the car, "this is what real leadership looks like." Lieutenant Morrison just turned an attack on her character into a lesson for all of us about the danger of assumptions. As the train pulled into Central Square, Richard gathered his briefcase and tablet with shaking hands. Before leaving, he turned back to Claire. "Lieutenant, if there's ever anything I can do, anything at all, please don't hesitate to contact me." He handed her a business card with an unsteady hand. "I mean that sincerely." Claire accepted the card and nodded. "Just remember this moment, Mr. Hawthorne. Remember that service comes in many forms, and sacrifice isn't always visible." After Richard left the train, the car's atmosphere began to normalize, but several passengers approached Claire to thank her for her service and apologize for not speaking up sooner. Commander Mitchell remained standing near her seat, creating a protective space that allowed her to process what had just happened. "How did you know?" Claire asked Mitchell quietly. "I've been very careful not to advertise my background." Mitchell sat down in the seat Richard had vacated, The way you controlled your breathing when he was in your face? The fact that you chose to de-escalate rather than engage. And that book? He nodded toward The Things They Carried. It's required reading for understanding what we carry home from war. Plus, you have the 1,000-yard stare that every combat veteran recognizes in each other. Claire smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. And you? Commander? What gives you away? Everything. Apparently, Mitchell chuckled. 28 years in the Corps will mark you permanently. I'm heading to the VA hospital. Actually, we have a program for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. If you're interested, we're always looking for people with your experience to help counsel other veterans. I already do some of that, Claire said. Part-time at the Veterans Center in Cambridge. It's difficult sometimes. Hard to explain to people who haven't been there. Which is exactly why we need people like you doing it. Mitchell replied. People who can look a struggling veteran in the eye and say, I've been where you are, and you can get through this. The train announced the next stop, and Claire began gathering her things. Commander, can I ask you something? Why did you step in? You could have just let him humiliate me and moved on with your day. Mitchell was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. Because I've seen too many good people broken by civilians who don't understand what military service costs. And because Lieutenant Claire Morrison saved my nephew's life in Helmand Province in 2018, Staff Sergeant David Mitchell, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines. Claire's eyes widened in recognition. Mitchell. David Mitchell. Convoy ambush outside FOB Shank. I remember. Her voice softened. How is he? Alive because of you. Married now. 2 kids. Works as a paramedic in Springfield. He talks about his guardian angel sniper sometimes. But he never knew your name. Mitchell stood as the train approached his stop. Would you mind if I told him I met you? He'd want to thank you properly. Tell him he already did. By making it home and building a good life. Claire said, That's the only thanks any of us need. As Mitchell prepared to leave the train, he turned back to Claire one final time. Lieutenant, what happened today? What that man said to you? That's not who you are. Don't let civilians who've never served define your worth. I won't. Sire, Claire replied, and for the first time in months, she meant it. The train pulled away from the station, and Claire settled back into her seat with a different feeling than she'd had in a long time. The book in her hands felt lighter somehow, and the weight she carried seemed more manageable. She still had 3 more stops before her destination, but for the first time since leaving the military, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. The other passengers in the car had returned to their morning routines, but there was a different energy now. A sense that they had all witnessed something important about courage, sacrifice, and the invisible struggles that people carry. An elderly gentleman approached Claire as she prepared to leave the train. Miss, I wanted to thank you too, he said quietly. My son served in Iraq, and he had a hard time when he came home. People like you, who help our veterans. You're doing God's work. Claire smiled and shook his hand. We take care of each other. See ya. That's what service means. As she stepped off the train and onto the platform, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in the 2 years since her discharge. A sense of pride in who she was and what she'd accomplished. Richard Hawthorne's attack had been meant to diminish her, but Commander Mitchell's intervention had reminded her of something she'd forgotten, that her service mattered, that her sacrifice had meaning, and that her worth wasn't determined by the judgment of strangers. Walking up the station stairs towards street level, Claire made a mental note to call the VA hospital when she got to work. Maybe it was time to increase her involvement with veteran services. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from who she was and start helping others find their way home from war. The business card Richard had given her was still in her pocket, and she found herself wondering if his law firm might be interested in pro bono work for veterans facing legal challenges. The morning sun was brighter than it had been when she'd entered the subway, and Boston looked different somehow, full of possibilities rather than obstacles. Lieutenant Claire Morrison was finally ready to stop carrying her service like a burden and start wearing it like the honor it had always been. Word count 2. 847. I need to continue the story to reach the required 8 null words. Let me continue with the aftermath and develop the story further. Later that day, Richard Hawthorne sat in his corner office on the 32nd floor of the Prudential Tower, staring out at the Boston skyline but seeing nothing. The mahogany desk that usually made him feel powerful now seemed like a barrier between him and the rest of humanity. His morning encounter with Lieutenant Morrison had shaken him in ways he couldn't fully articulate, forcing him to confront aspects of his character he'd spent years avoiding. The law firm of Hawthorne and Associates specialized in corporate litigation, helping wealthy clients protect their assets and minimize their liabilities. Richard had built his reputation on being ruthless, on seeing through people's facades to exploit their weaknesses. Today, however, he realized that his skill at reading people had failed him completely when it mattered most. The woman he'd dismissed as worthless had sacrificed more for her country than he'd ever sacrificed for anything. His secretary buzzed him on the intercom. "Mr. Hawthorne, your wife called. She wanted to remind you about the charity gala tonight for the Wounded Warrior Project." The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent hundreds of dollars on a table at an event honoring the very people he'd just humiliated on public transportation. "Cancel it," he said quietly. "Sir, it's a $5,000 commitment, and Mrs. Hawthorne is expecting to attend." "I said cancel it, Patricia, and see if you can get me the contact information for the Boston Veterans Center." He paused, running his hands through his graying hair. "Actually, cancel my appointments for the rest of the day. I need to take care of something." Meanwhile, Claire had arrived at the Veterans Center in Cambridge, a modest building that served as a lifeline for hundreds of former military personnel struggling with the transition to civilian life. The center offered counseling services, job placement assistance, and most importantly, a place where veterans could talk to people who understood their experiences without judgment or platitudes. Dr. Sarah Chen, the center's director, noticed immediately that Claire seemed different. "Good morning, Claire. You look lighter today. Did something happen?" Claire hung up her jacket and settled into her small office, which was decorated with photos from her military service and letters from veterans she'd helped. "You could say that I had a reminder today about why this work matters." She spent the next hour preparing for her first appointment, a young Marine named Tommy Rodriguez, who'd returned from his second deployment to Iraq 6 months earlier. Tommy struggled with anxiety and anger issues that made holding a job difficult, and he'd been coming to see Claire twice a week since his discharge. When Tommy arrived, Claire could see the familiar signs of a bad night written across his face: the hollow eyes, the slightly trembling hands, the way he checked the room's exits before sitting down. She'd worn the same expression for months after coming home. "Rough weekend?" she asked gently. "Same old shit. Different day," Tommy replied, slumping into the chair across from her desk. "Had another panic attack at the grocery store yesterday. Some kid dropped a bag of cans, and the noise just... fuck. I hit the deck like we were taking incoming..." Claire nodded, understanding completely. "What happened after you went down?" People stared. This one lady started recording with her phone, probably thought it was funny. Her kid was laughing. Tommy's hands clenched into fists. "I wanted to explain, you know? Tell them that I'm not crazy, that I served my country, that I've seen things they can't imagine." But how do you explain that to people who think PTSD is just an excuse for weakness? The parallel to her morning experience wasn't lost on Claire. "Tommy, can I tell you something that happened to me today?" She recounted the subway incident. Watching, as Tommy's expression shifted from self-pity to outrage on her behalf, then to something approaching pride when she described Commander Mitchell's intervention. "So this asshole just assumed you were worthless because of how you looked?" Tommy asked. "Exactly. And for a moment, I almost believed him. After 2 years of trying to blend in, but of downplaying my service, of accepting that most people would never understand what we've been through, I started to internalize their judgment." Tommy leaned forward, engaged in a way Claire rarely saw from him. "But the commander, he set him straight? He did more than that. He reminded me that our service has value, regardless of whether civilians recognize it, and he showed me that there are still people who understand what sacrifice means." Claire pulled out Richard's business card and placed it on the desk between them. "This man who humiliated me, he gave me his card and offered to help if I ever needed anything. You think he meant it?" Claire considered the question carefully. "I think he was genuinely shaken by learning the truth. Whether that translates into meaningful change remains to be seen." She looked directly at Tommy. "But here's what I realized today. We can't control how others perceive us, but we can control how we perceive ourselves. I spent 2 years trying to hide who I am, and it wasn't making me happier or more functional. It was just making me smaller." Their session continued for another 40 minutes, with Tommy showing more engagement and genuine emotional processing than Claire had seen in weeks. When he left, he stood a little straighter and made eye contact when he thanked her for her time. Claire's next appointment was with Maria Santos, a former Army helicopter mechanic who'd lost her left arm to an IED explosion in Afghanistan. Maria struggled with depression and had been resistant to most forms of therapy until she started working with Claire. "You seem different today," Maria observed as she settled into her chair. "Something good happen?" Claire found herself telling the story again and again, watching as the narrative seemed to resonate with her client's own experiences of civilian judgment and misunderstanding. "The part that gets me," Maria said, "is how that guy just assumed he knew everything about you based on your appearance. Like, I wear a prosthetic, so people either treat me like a hero or like I'm broken. There's no middle ground where I'm just a person who happens to be missing an arm." "How do you handle the hero worship?" Claire asked, genuinely curious. "Better than I handle the pity," Maria admitted. "But honestly, sometimes I wish I could wear a sign that says, 'I'm not your inspiration porn.' I didn't lose my arm to inspire anybody. I lost it because I was doing my job. And sometimes bad shit happens when you're doing dangerous work." Their conversation continued along similar lines, with both women finding common ground in their shared frustration with civilian misconceptions about military service and disability. By the end of the session, Maria had agreed to attend a group therapy session the following week, something she'd been avoiding for months. As Claire prepared for her third appointment of the day, her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but something made her answer. "Veterans Center. This is Claire." "Miss Morrison? Lieutenant Morrison? This is Richard Hawthorne. We met this morning on the train." Claire felt her stomach tighten. "Mr. Hawthorne, I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I hope you don't mind that I tracked down your workplace. I got the number from the VA hospital." His voice was different than it had been on the train, less commanding and more uncertain. "I was wondering if we could meet. I'd like to discuss something with you." Claire hesitated. "What kind of something?" "I've been thinking about what happened this morning, about what Commander Mitchell said, and about my own behavior. I owe you more than just an apology." He paused. "I'd like to propose a way to make amends that might actually benefit veterans like yourself." Against her better judgment, Claire found herself intrigued. What did you have in mind? Could we meet for coffee today? If possible. I know it's short notice, but I think you'll be interested in what I have to say. Claire checked her schedule. Her last appointment was at 3 p.m., and she could be free by 4:30. There's a coffee shop called Grounds for Change on Mass Ave, near Harvard Square. Could you meet me there at 5? Absolutely. And Lieutenant, thank you for giving me this chance. After hanging up, Claire sat back in her chair, wondering what she'd just agreed to. Part of her wanted to help Richard Hawthorne find a path to redemption, but another part wondered if this was just another way for a privileged man to ease his conscience without making real changes. Her final appointment of the day was with James Wilson, a Navy veteran in his 50s who'd served in the Gulf War and struggled with alcoholism since his discharge. James had been sober for 6 months, his longest period of sobriety in 20 years, and his sessions with Claire had been crucial to his recovery. You know what I was thinking about on my way over here? James said as he settled into his usual chair. How different things might have been if I'd had someone like you to talk to when I first got out. Someone who understood what it was like to come home from war and feel like you don't fit anywhere. Claire smiled. The important thing is that you're here now, doing the work. Recovery isn't about timing, it's about commitment. Speaking of commitment, James said, I wanted to tell you that I've been accepted into the peer counselor training program. They want me to help other veterans with substance abuse issues. James, that's incredible news. How do you feel about it? Scared shitless, if I'm being honest, but also excited, like maybe all the pain I've been through could actually help someone else avoid the same mistakes. He paused, studying Claire's face. You taught me that our experiences, even the bad ones, can have value if we use them to help others. After James left, Claire found herself thinking about the theme that had run through all of her sessions that day, the idea that their military service and subsequent struggles could be transformed into sources of strength and purpose. It was a message she'd been giving to her clients for months, but somehow she'd failed to apply it to her own life, until Commander Mitchell forced her to remember her worth. At 4:45, Claire arrived at Grounds for Change, a small coffee shop known for its social justice mission and veteran-friendly atmosphere. Richard was already there, sitting at a corner table with what appeared to be a stack of legal documents beside him. He stood when she entered, and she noticed that he'd changed out of his expensive suit into more casual clothes that made him seem less intimidating. Lieutenant Morrison, thank you for coming, he said, standing to shake her hand. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee. Black, she replied, settling into the chair across from him. As Richard went to order their drinks, Claire studied the documents he'd left on the table. The top page had the letterhead of Hawthorne and Associates, and she could see references to pro bono services and veterans advocacy. Richard returned with their coffee and sat down, his usual commanding presence replaced by something that looked like nervous energy. I've been thinking about this morning nonstop, he began, about my behavior, about my assumptions, and about what Commander Mitchell said about service and sacrifice. Claire sipped her coffee and waited for him to continue. The truth is, I've spent my entire career helping wealthy people protect their assets from any form of accountability. I've gotten very good at finding ways for privileged individuals to avoid consequences for their actions. He gestured toward the documents. But I've never used my skills to help people who actually deserve legal representation. And you want to change that? I want to establish a veterans legal aid program through my firm. Free legal services for veterans dealing with disability claims, housing issues, employment discrimination, anything where they need representation but can't afford it. He pulled the top document toward her. I've already spoken with my partners about dedicating 20% of our resources to pro bono work specifically for veterans. Claire looked over the proposal, impressed despite herself by its comprehensiveness. This is substantial. Why veterans specifically? Richard met her eyes. Because this morning I realized that I've been living in a bubble, surrounded by privilege and insulated from the reality of what service actually costs. I insulted someone who'd sacrificed more for this country than I've sacrificed for anything. And I did it because I couldn't see past my own prejudices. This is guilt. Then, Claire said, you want to do good works to ease your conscience? It started as guilt, Richard admitted, but it's become something more. I spent the afternoon researching veteran suicide rates, homelessness, statistics. The percentage of veterans who struggle with legal issues related to their service. Did you know that veterans are twice as likely to die by suicide as civilians? Claire nodded grimly. I know the statistics better than I'd like to. Then you know that apologizing to you isn't enough. The problem isn't just one asshole on a train. It's a society that fails to support the people who serve it. Richard leaned forward. I can't fix society, but I can use my skills and resources to help individual veterans navigate systems that seem designed to work against them. Claire studied the man across from her, trying to reconcile the arrogant lawyer from the train with this person who seemed genuinely committed to making amends. What would you need from me? Advice. Insight into what veterans actually need from legal services. Help identifying the most pressing issues and the best ways to address them. He paused. And maybe, if you're willing, a partnership. The Veterans Center and my firm could work together to provide comprehensive support. Claire was quiet for a long moment, considering the offer. Richard, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Have you ever sacrificed anything that really mattered to you? Not money or time, but something that changed who you are fundamentally. Richard was quiet for a long time, and Claire could see him wrestling with the question. No, he finally said. I don't think I have. I've worked hard, built a successful career, provided for my family, but I've never put myself at risk for something bigger than my own interests. Then you need to understand that what you're proposing isn't just about legal services. It's about recognizing that veterans have given something you can't fully comprehend, and they deserve better than what they're getting. Claire leaned back in her chair. If you're serious about this, if you really want to make a difference, you'll need to listen more than you talk and learn more than you teach. I understand, Richard said. Will you help me? Claire looked at the proposal again, thinking about Tommy's panic attacks, Maria's struggles with civilian perceptions, James's journey toward recovery, and all the other veterans she'd worked with who needed exactly this kind of support. I'll help, she said finally, but I have conditions. First, any veteran who comes to your firm gets treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their appearance or circumstances. Second, you personally handle some of these cases, not just delegate them to junior associates. And third, this isn't about making you feel better about yourself. This is about serving people who've already served. Richard extended his hand across the table. Agreed. All of it. As they shook hands, Claire felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope that civilian society might actually be capable of change. That bridges could be built between the military and civilian worlds, and that her own painful experiences might be transformed into something that could help others. 3 months later, the Hawthorne Veterans Legal Aid Project had handled 47 cases, securing over $2 million in disability benefits for veterans whose claims had been wrongfully denied. Richard had personally represented a homeless veteran facing eviction, a former Marine fighting employment discrimination, and a Navy veteran trying to get proper medical care for service-connected injuries. Claire stood at the podium in the Prudential Towers conference room, addressing an audience of lawyers, veterans advocates, and local politicians who had gathered to hear about the project's success. Richard sat in the front row, No longer the arrogant man who had harassed her on the train, but someone who had learned to channel his skills toward justice rather than profit. The most important lesson we've learned, Claire said, looking out at the audience, is that supporting veterans isn't about charity or pity. It's about recognizing that people who've served have skills, experience, and perspectives that make our communities stronger. She paused, making eye contact with Richard, and it's about understanding that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can create the most meaningful change. As applause filled the room, Claire thought about the subway ride that had started it all. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had become a catalyst for something neither she nor Richard could have imagined. The Marine sniper and the corporate lawyer had found common ground in service to others, proving that redemption was possible when people were willing to confront their own limitations and work towards something bigger than themselves. Commander Mitchell, who had been invited to speak about the importance of veteran advocacy, approached the podium as Claire finished her remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you've witnessed here today is what we in the military call force multiplication. One person's courage inspires another's transformation, which creates opportunities for others to serve." He looked at Claire with obvious pride. "Lieutenant Morrison reminded us all that day on the train that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. Sometimes, it's just beginning." As the audience dispersed, several veterans who had been helped by the Legal Aid Project approached Claire and Richard. Among them was Tommy Rodriguez, who now worked as a peer counselor at the Veterans Center, his anxiety managed through therapy and his purpose renewed through helping other struggling veterans. "Lieutenant Morrison," Tommy said, "I wanted you to know that the housing case Mr. Hawthorne handled for me changed everything. Having a stable place to live meant I could focus on recovery instead of just survival." He turned to Richard. "Thank you for seeing me as a person worth fighting for." Richard clasped Tommy's hand firmly. "Thank you for letting me learn what real service looks like." Maria Santos wheeled over in her custom wheelchair. Having recently started law school herself, with encouragement from the project team, "Claire, I've been thinking about our conversation that day about inspiration porn. What you two have built here isn't about making people feel good about helping veterans. It's about creating systemic change." "That's exactly right," Claire replied. "Real support means changing the systems that fail veterans, not just treating the symptoms." As the evening wound down, Richard found himself alone with Claire in the now empty conference room. The city lights of Boston twinkled below them, and both reflected on how much had changed since that morning on the Red Line. "You know," Richard said, "I keep thinking about what you asked me that day in the coffee shop, about whether I'd ever really sacrificed anything. I think I'm finally beginning to understand what sacrifice means." Claire smiled. "It's not about losing something, Richard. It's about choosing something bigger than yourself, even when it costs you personally." The partners weren't thrilled when I told them we'd be dedicating resources to pro bono work, Richard admitted. "Some of our corporate clients have questioned our commitment to their interests. My income has dropped significantly, and how does that feel? Like the first time in my adult life that I'm actually earning what I make." Richard said, "Every dollar we don't collect from veterans' cases feels more valuable than every million we used to help corporations avoid responsibility." Claire gathered her notes from the presentation. "The real test isn't what we've accomplished in 3 months. It's whether this work continues when the novelty wears off. When helping veterans becomes routine rather than revolutionary, it will continue," Richard said with conviction. "Because you taught me something that day on the train that I'd never learned in all my years of legal training, that justice isn't about winning cases or maximizing profits. It's about using whatever power you have to protect people who need protection." As they prepared to leave, Claire looked out at the Boston skyline one more time. "You know what I realized today? That train ride was the best thing that happened to both of us. Your attack forced me to stop hiding from who I am. and my response forced you to confront who you wanted to become. Sometimes, Richard said, the most important battles are the ones that transform us rather than defeat us. They rode the elevator down together, two people whose lives had been forever changed by 4 minutes of confrontation that had revealed both the worst and best of human nature. Outside, the same Red Line train that had brought them together carried new passengers through the city, each with their own hidden stories of service, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle to find their place in a world that often failed to see their true worth.